I'm Dr. Joseph MD, Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai. This is E-Pathshala project on religion and society, and this is module 9, in which we are looking at Islam in India. In this module, we look at the development of Islam in India, how Islam has originated in India, and how has Islam flourished in India. We look at the differentiation within Islam. We look at the growth of Islamic identity and the way that Muslims and Islam is actually looked at in India, in contemporary India. And this is what we look at in this module. Now, in this chapter, we are looking at an overview of some of the important strands of research in anthropology and sociology in India under the rubric of Islam in India. Now, Islam in India is a very large topic. So many things, so much studies have been done. There are so many Islamic denominations, as it were, groups are there, so many communities are there, and therefore, it will take a long time to understand Islam in that sense from an Indian perspective and an Indian point of view. However, we are looking at very few topics here. One is the dissemination of Islam, anthropology of Islam, social organization of Muslims, and Islamic reform and political identity in India. We will take each of these topics one by one. What we can see is that the plurality of Islam in India is something that one should look at in many different ways, because it is in this plurality that we can find out the many aspects of Islam. Now, a couple of things that I would like to add here, in addition to what is actually on screen that you see, the sectarian or independent reform movements within Islam in India. It is one thing to say that reform has a historical origin, no doubt about it, because reform is something in India. When we say reform movements, we are looking at movements that have happened in different parts of India. We look at the dissemination of Islam. There have been various modes of conversion in different parts of India. Such an understanding refutes the claim of coercive nature of Islam in India. Though regimes which we can call as Muslim had ruled Bengal from 13th century, it was only in the 16th century that a Muslim community emerged there. In 16th century Bengal, according to Richard Eaton, it was the enterprising cultivator who was central to religious dissemination. Since most of the cultivators were Muslims, the dominant form of piety established was of Islamic cultural universe. In the southwest coast of India, Stephen F. Dale argues that the figure of the merchant was key to the diffusion of Islam. Islam spread through the marital associations between the merchants and the women of the locality. Now, coming to the anthropology of Islam, sociologists and anthropologists are concerned with concrete form the faith showcases in actual lives of the people in varied contexts. Now, one of the earliest person to study Islam in India from a social science perspective is Imtiaz Ahmad. He argues that since Islam is heavily influenced by local environments, it has both local and scriptural dimensions. Although such local flavors may contradict the fundamental notions of Islam, Muslims do not see them as mutually contradictory but as complementary, thereby engendering greater degree of pluralism in beliefs and practices. Now, Imtiaz Ahmad has also written kind of a work on how caste or the lack of it or the practice of it, or how endogamy plays an important fact or important part in the Islamic communities in India. Another person who has done some anthropological studies on Islam is Francis Robinson. He actually contests Ahmad by saying that Ahmad overemphasizes actual beliefs and practices at the cost of overlooking the transformations in terms of meaning and understanding over time. In a long-term historical understanding, a pattern of perfection is observable in Islam in India. One of the well-known anthropologists of India, Veena Das, argues that both the above understanding derive from the notion that normative Islam constitutes a single whole with a unilinear pattern of perfection and an unchanging essence. since Quran does not provide a single pattern of perfection, the existence of innumerable commentaries attest to that. Our aim should be to understand both text and practice as constituting a whole. She refers to this framework as folk theology and theological anthropology. Now, the central argument that Veena thus makes is that there is a wrong way in which we are perceiving Islam because of the centrality of Quran, but the fact that Quran itself has got many commentaries on the meanings of it, it points to a lack of that kind of a centrality. Secondly, there is when we talk about Islam, we are talking about normative Islam, which is coming from the books of law and the book of the Prophet. But Islam in its lived kind of experience, it is much more than that in its plurality and its diversity. Now we look at the socio-historical formations in Islam. In the nationalist narratives, India was largely a politically bounded entity with two clearly defined religious communities. Hindus were considered as the original inhabitants of the land and Muslims as foreigners. Now this has been a consistent kind of a narrative that however we look at it, the Hindu character of the land and the Muslim as invaders or foreigners. The British colonial officials and historians constructed a historical narrative where India's, that is, the idea of a unified India itself was a colonial construction. India's past was divided into three phases: a golden Hindu rule, an intolerant Muslim interlude, and the era of the British. The idea of a golden past and a presumed oppression by Muslims was used by even the nationalist narratives to inculcate self-pride and the need for takeover in the context of anti-colonial struggles, which resulted in creating an impression of a monolithic, homogeneous notion of Islam and Muslims in India. Now, what this means is that the idea of a unified understanding of Muslims in India is something that evolved historically due to different reasons, and one of them is what is seen in the writings of British colonial officials who talked about a golden Hindu past and an Islamic interlude and the era of the British. And it also became very strong in the narratives and of the nationalists in India, where they imagine India, first of all, India as an entity is a colonial construction. Now they imagine India and give to India a particular Hindu character, and considering Hindus as original inhabitants and Muslims as foreigners. Now this idea of the golden past and the presumed oppression by Buddhists have become kind of a common thread, which has in some cases looked at Islam as bounded, Islam as one, Islam as in some sense the other of the Hindu India. Now, coming back, the other topic with regard to socio-historical formation, something that we can say is, socio-historical formation, the way that many peoples, many kings and emperors rules in mainly North India is seen as Islamic rule of the whole of India. Now, this is again fallacious because India as an entity, as we know of now, is imagined in the colonial period, not before. So, what we have before the colonial period is not really India. It is a collection of different kingdoms and different principalities, maybe with a common cultural stream, but there were divergences and differences as well. Now, it is only during the British period that what we know today of India, South Asian subcontinent, was imagined as one political entity, not before. And therefore, if you look at people commonly call as the Islamic rule, maybe the rule of the Mughals or the Pathans or the Sultanate, all of that was confined to certain areas in North India, number one. Obviously, there was Nizam and there was the king of Bijapur, or there was Tipu Sultan. There were Muslim rulers in the south as well, but these were all independent kingdoms. And also, because the Mughals or the Pathans happened to be Muslims, to call that as a Muslim invasion or the Muslim rule will be again wrong, because they are very different type of people, and therefore the fact that they belong to Muslim may have nothing to do with it. They happen to be Muslims. So that is one of the ways in which that we need to look at this historical formation. But at the same time, today there is a lot of ways in which all of these historical facts or historical events are given a twist to suit particular political kind of formations or political developments in the present day India. And one needs to be very careful about it, very clear about it, and see how we can correlate the arguments of today to the facts of the past. And we need much more kind of research in this. Now we go to the social organization of Muslims. The general understanding in using caste to study the social organization of Muslims in India is that it can be applied to communities other than Hindus if we take it to be both structural and cultural phenomena. Imtiaz Ahmad, as I have said before, characterizes 4 features such as endogamy, occupational specialization, hierarchical ordering, and ideological religious philosophy undergirding the system, and analyzes whether these features correspond to the system of stratification existing among Muslims in various parts of the country. Ahmad concludes that the social divisions among Muslims are similar to social divisions among the Hindus, and thus it can be termed caste, though an exact replica cannot be found. But if caste among Muslims owes itself directly to the acculturative influence of Hinduism, the constant Islamizations would have eliminated such practices. However, majority of works done on various Muslim communities across India shows that Islamization has actually reinforced such social divisions and inequalities rather than destroying them. Now, in this section, what we have done is we have looked at specifically at the question of caste in Islam. Now, if you look at caste in Hinduism, caste in Islam, caste in Christianity, and caste in other religions, we would get a very diverse picture. Now, it is also said that there is a discourse which says that as Islam is looking at universal brotherhood and ideas of brotherhood and sisterhood which are so strong in Islam, Islam by its very nature does not encourage distinctions of caste. But it's also a fact that many of the parameters that are laid down by social scientists as features of caste, such as endogamy, is found very strong among many of the Muslim communities, where there is very little kind of what we call intermarriages, and intermarriage specifically in addition to other practices of exclusion. And therefore, many of the studies have shown that caste discrimination or caste exclusions based on caste in different forms, in different ways, is active among many of the Muslims in India. Now, the thing is, the question arises because of which is caste something very specifically religious, or is caste a cultural practice? One can say it is both. In the case of Muslims or other minorities or other non-Hindu religions in India, caste becomes more cultural than religiously sanctioned. Whereas in Hinduism, caste is both cultural and also religiously sanctioned, as we can read from many of the books that are characterized as Hindu. Now we go to the next topic, which is about reform in Islam. Reform is a word that we use quite often in the context of India, especially in the time of the British period. Now we talk about a whole lot of reform movements in India in the early 19th century, started by Raja Ram Mohan Roy and others. So reform is the word that we use for the kind of changes that began to be happened in India during the British period. So we apply this kind of an understanding of reformed Islam and see what type of reform movements have started in Islam. The reform in Islam has meant in the modern period about the reformation of individual behavior and communities, and a reorganization of Islamic knowledge, practices, and institutions in the light of Western models. So this connection with West is very important in the understanding of what is reform. Francis Robinson emphasizes 5 aspects of Islamic reform in the modern era. Attempts to make revelation and tradition significant for the present and the resultant loss of the authority of the past. A renewed emphasis on human will in a world without political power. A growing self-affirmation, individualism, self-effectiveness achieved through willed activity and self-transformation. Formation into an ideology by a relationship of Islam from scripturalism. And 5, a process of secularization within which 2 aspects of disenchantment and environment. That's a process of secularization. So that's the last point with regard to reform. In response to the British rule, in response to India's exposure to Western modernity, or in response to what we can say as Indian modernity itself. Now the question is that do we have to understand reform only in that particular perspective? There can be reform in other perspectives as well. For a reform to happen in any religious or socio-cultural stratum or kind of realm, we don't need connection with European modernity at all. So if you look at it from that perspective, we can see that there have been many attempts of, differences of opinion among Muslims within Islam, different interpretations of the Quran and the Hadith, and different ways in which the society within Islam is conceptualized. For example, the name of Askari Ali Engineer, the Islamic scholar, comes to one's mind when we look at reform in Islam. The way that he has been able to give very progressive and in sense very, very different kind of interpretations to Quran and other kind of juridical texts in Islam in such a manner to show that many things that are stereotypically talked about Islam in India is not true, and it doesn't bear any kind of correspondence with the fact of Muslims in India. Now, another important area under so much of discussion is Islam as an identity and political identity with regard to people who talk about voting patterns and support to political parties, ideological formations and the sense, and so on. The construction of Muslim political identity has been an indispensable part of the nationalist movement in India. Partition and independence created a scenario where the loyalty of Muslims to the nation was questioned. Gyanendra Pandey argues that constructions of a nationalist mainstream, and then you have others that are talking about the same thing. Now he argues that constructions of a nationalist mainstream, for example, the essential natural soul and the minorities as the foil against which the mainstream is constituted, have been central to nation-state formation in India. So there is again a way in which there is, in popular parlance, people say that Muslims vote en bloc for a political party of their choice. Again, this is something that needs larger scrutiny. Now, if Muslim community in India is as diverse as any other community, how can one hold that their voting behavior is very similar? And also the fact points out to us, the fact stands very clear in front of our minds and in front of our eyes, that Muslims are part of all political formations in India, whether to the right, center or the left. And that kind of a diversity points out to a political diversity of interests of different Muslim communities in India, which may be more class and economics based than with any kind of a primordial religious identity. So this is something that we need to take note of. And all in all of these things point to a very plural, vibrant Muslim community in India, which is as much Indian and as much culturally rooted as any other community, and with aspirations and also it is worthwhile to mention here the different commissions of inquiry and committees that Indian government has made, that they have consistently pointed out this fact that when it comes to socio-economic indicators, Muslim communities in different parts of India fare very badly, and in some cases even worse than some of the Dalit or scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities across India. Now this is kind of a fact that comes to the fore, and this is something that we have to again look at very specifically in this context. In this module we have looked at Islam, particularly Islam in India. We have looked at the heterogeneity of Muslims, because homogeneity is something that is commonsensically talked about. And then we have looked at the different parameters in which Muslim identity is constructed and lived in India. Thank you.